And I'm delighted to have with us Julia Cagé in conversation with Alice McCrum, talking about news as a public good. This is a subject very important to libraries, of course. We're charged with protecting information, and we've found ourselves in a place of trying to promote and establish a positive and virtuous and fair information ecosystem, which is becoming more and more challenging. So I'm really excited by this conversation. Cagé is Associate Professor of Economics at Sciences Po and a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research. She researches and publishes widely on a variety of topics, including economic history, political economy, and media economy. And in addition to her abundant scholarship in academic journals, she is also the author of several award-winning books that are fit for both the general and a scholarly audience. And many of them have been translated into English, so I highly recommend that you look her up and purchase her books. Those titles include Saving the Media, Capitalism, Crowdfunding, and Democracy, and The Price of Democracy, How Money Shapes Politics and What to Do About It. Cagé will be in conversation with Alice McCrum, who has been heading up cultural programming here at the library for over a year now. She's currently pursuing a master's degree in environmental studies at Sciences Po, and also hosts a podcast about James Joyce with the Shakespeare and Company.
Thank you so much. Really delighted to be having this conversation. And as the time always runs by, we're just gonna get straight to it. So I think in your recent work, we can explore the question of media concentration. And before we turn to a kind of more international market, so American English, I think we should begin in France. You point out, Julia, that in France, French media is controlled, 90% of French media is controlled by a handful of billionaires. And at the helm of this concentration, I'm sure you've all heard recently in the news, is Vincent Bolloré, the French billionaire tycoon who has been called the new king of European media for the power that he exerts in and across different spheres, although he will call them synergies, in publishing, advertising, television, news, radio, and print publications, so really a wide range. As we get started here, Julia, can you tell us about the history of Bolloré and why the current buyout of TF1, which is France's private television station by the M6 group, and this buyout is still in process, but why is it threatening pluralism and democracy itself?
Much, and thanks for the invitation. I think we can draw from the beginning a parallel between what is happening in France and what is happening in the rest of the Western democracies, which is the fact that I will date it like somewhere between like 2007 and 2010, that you have more and more people from outside of the media industry who decided to enter the media industry. So in the US, the most famous case has been the one of Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post. At the same time in France, you had in 2010 the buyout of Le Monde by 2 billionaires and 1 millionaire, but like 3 rich guys. Out of them, like Xavier Niel, who is like a billionaire who make his fortune in the telecommunication industry. You had Patrick Drahi, with another French billionaire who make his fortune in the telecommunication industry, who bought BFM TV, who bought RMC, who also bought Libération. And you had like a growing concentration of the French media, with as of today, you have like 7 or 8 people owning like more than 90% of all the audience of the top media outlets in France. So you have a huge degree of concentration. If you look at this history, the entry of Vincent Bolloré on the French media market is relatively recent. In fact, he entered a little bit in 2012, but this was kind of a false start. So he really became a big player in the French media market in 2015 when he decided to buy the group Canal+. So Canal+ group was made of 3 television channels, basically, which was Canal+, a TV channel that was called iTélé at the time, and that now is called the CNews, and then other TV channel that was called D8 at the time, and that is now called C8. So there is everything with a C at Vincent Bolloré. He also renamed one of his daily free daily newspapers, C News, like the TV channel. The case of Vincent Bolloré is of particular interest, but also particularly worrisome for the democratic game, because he is a media owner who intervene a lot in the media industry. So basically, we have done with three friends and co-authors, Nicolas Hervé, Camille Urvois, and Maurice Engel. We decided to study the impact of the takeover of Vincent Bolloré on the Canal Plus group, on the content produced by the three TV channels, and in particular the political bias of these three TV channels. And one of the things that we have documented is that, like everything else equal, in particular if you take into account, like what we call time fixed effect, so like variation, in the political spectrum in France, and if you compared what is happening, for example, on CNews with what is happening for the rest of the media outlets in France, what we see that there have been an increase by 20 percentage points in the speaking time of the radical right on CNews following the takeover by Vincent Bolloré. And this is kind of a huge shift, in particular when you know that in France, this idea of having like a pluralism within TV channels should be respected by law. So I don't know whether you followed a little bit the French presidential elections, but basically Eric Zemmour, who at the end of the day arrived fourth. So some people said like, oh, it was a failure, but he did better than the candidate of the mainstream right-wing party. So he obtained 7% of the votes in the first round compared to 4.7% for Valérie Pécresse. So he did pretty well. In fact, this guy did not exist as a politician 1 year ago. He was a journalist. He was a journalist on TV, and in particular, he was a journalist on TV 1 hour a day on CNews. And basically, he was pushed as a politician by Vincent Bolloré. So this guy, in fact, made credible candidate at the presidential election. And what is even more worrisome with Vincent Bolloré is that it's not only about TV, and now it's also about radio, given that he also took over Europe 1. The French TV radio stations, and now it's also about the publishing industry. So he was already at the head of Editis, who is the number 2 publishing company in France, and now he's buying Hachette, that is the number 1. So number 1 plus number 2, it makes like a big one. Plus he also bought the Prisma company. So perhaps you don't know Prisma, but if you take sometimes reading Voici or Gala or even Téléstar or Télé 7 jours. Basically, this is the largest magazine company in France. He also bought this one. So now you have, a lot of power like within the hand of one single owner.
Yeah, so I think to this point, Julia, there are 2 things to say. First, it seems, to this exact point, that as we start our conversation here, I want to be very conscious about how we define media, because you make this point in your essay for free television against Bolloré. You write that, according to the dictionary, a media, this is the official definition, is a process allowing the distribution, the diffusion, or the communication of works, documents, or audio-visual messages, which, of course, before the arrival of the internet and social media was already very broad. But now we find ourselves fitting in things like, in addition to what you've just described, Netflix, you write, is a media, social networks, Twitter, Facebook, Twitch, Instagram, search engines, and even other content aggregators. So my first question is, how are we defining media? And then my second question, you mentioned Bolloré's disproportional political power. Can you also talk about your findings of censorship and self-censorship, particularly of journalists?
So the question about defining a media, the first point is, why do we care? And we do care about defining the media because part of the media industry is regulated and part is not. So in France, the regulation of the media was introduced in 1986. You were not born. Internet neither. And we still have the same regulation. So as of today, for example, if you look at the French law regulating the media industry, in terms of concentration, you have a rule that is called like 2 out of 3. But that means that you cannot have more than 2 out of 3 support. The support is being TV, radio, and newspapers. Internet is not part of it. So we need to define the media, because we need to know what do we want to regulate and how we want to regulate it. First reason. So the second reason why we need to define the media, and we might come back to it if we talk about TF1 M6, is in terms of media concentration. Obviously, it's not the same thing to say that TF1 is competing with France 2 or to say that TF1 is competing with Google. Now, in one case, you can have a high degree of concentration, and in the other one, you cannot. Okay.
And just that was a really great interview that you gave with an American journalist, and to this point about the kind of old media laws. This really struck me as a metaphor that I think we can think about when thinking about the media laws. You said that using media laws from before the arrival of the internet is like regulating high-speed trains with laws designed for horse-drawn carriages.
Yep. Yeah. No, and the thing is, I don't know how to define exactly the media, but I liked what the European Commission just did. So I don't know whether you see that in the news, but like a couple of days ago, the European Commission and the European Parliament, they agree on 2 very important acts, the Digital Market Act and the Digital Services Act. And their approach is the following. They said, in fact, we shouldn't think in terms of, let's say, support, regulate like what is like print media or TV or radio, or regulate what is on the internet, because if you go on the internet, you have a lot of TV, and you are going to regulate TV, but not YouTube, knowing that on YouTube, you will have a lot of like videos from TV. And in fact, if you do regulate, I don't know, Le Monde, at the end of the day, you will have it both online and offline. So you just want to regulate the print version. It makes no sense. And so it's a very complicated problem to tackle. And they had this great idea, because I really think this is the way to approach the question. And I'm not, like usually, I'm not so positive with respect to what the European Commission do, in particular in the media sector. But I think this time it's very good news. They say we have to think in terms of systemic platform. So this is not so much about the support, like whether you are print or like social media or online media or like TV, radio. This is about how many consumers you reach. So they say, okay, we are going to look at 2 criteria. The first one is your total revenues, or we are going to look at the total number of European users you reach. And basically, if you reach more than 10% of the European population, so it's around like 45 million users, like it will be the case of Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, but it will also be the case, this is a broad regulation of like some online website, then you will need to have to respect a certain number of rules. And among these rules, there will be some regulation of speech. And the idea is to say that everything that is forbidden offline should be forbidden online. And you also need to introduce transparency for the algorithm. And I really think this is the way we should approach the problem, because like defining what is a media per se, it's kind of like way too complicated as of today. Is your podcast a media, for example?
I hope so.
Yeah. So when you will have 45 million listeners,
which we already do. Can you talk about the self-censorship of journalists with Bolloré, departing from? So you cite Proust at the beginning of your essay. This is my translation. But he says, or a character says, this is in a collection of essays that was collected after he died. I have arrived at a moment, or if you like, I find myself in such circumstances, and this is, you're talking about France here, it's quite polemical, where one can fear the things one would most like to say, and one can no longer suddenly say them.
So like the entire story of that is because when I was looking for a title, so the title I wanted to give to the book was simply Contre Bolloré. And I wanted to call it Contre Bolloré because I had in mind this Contre Sainte-Beuve of Proust. And then, you know, at the time I was finishing the book, I was like, okay, so I read like Contre Sainte-Beuve perhaps 20 years ago. So I need to read it again one more time. So I was reading Contre Sainte-Beuve, and to be totally honest, I was like, okay, so I'm going to use this title, but there is really like nothing in common between the two things, except that I reading Proust, I found this sentence, and I was like, Yes, this is about that. So I had a good reason to call my book Contre Bolloré, and I was happy about it. I think it's about Bolloré, but it's not so much about Bolloré for a good reason is because with Bolloré, you don't even need self-censorship, you have direct censorship.
Right, exactly.
So the issue
tell us about both.
Of self-censorship is an issue you have with a lot of different media owners, but with Bolloré, you know, it's like much simpler and straightforward. When he's unhappy with a journalist, he fired him or her. And when he's unhappy with content, he censored the content. He did that from the beginning. In 2015, when he bought Canal Plus, he decided to censor like a documentary, investigation documentary he did not like, and then he just decided to suppress all documentaries on Canal Plus. So it was easier at the end of the day. There were also a number of shows like Grand Journal. Decided to put an end to the Grand Journal. He also put an end to the Guignol de l'Info. So basically, you know, he took the program and he changed everything. On iTélé, that later became CNews, he decided to impose a number of decisions, content and journalists. They were the longest strike in the history of French private television on iTélé. It did not move. And basically, you had more than 2/3 of the newsroom who quit it. And some of them were kind of completely fired. Then in recent years in Canal Plus in particular, again, he fired some journalists he was unhappy with. Basically, they were one guy who was doing humorist, you say that?
Yeah, like a comedian.
He was unhappy with one of the sketch, so he fired him. And then you had another journalist who supported the comedian. He was also fired. And then you had a strike in front of the channel when all the guys on strike, they went with a mask because they were afraid. But some of them, they just sign up like a text in support. Part of them were kind of fired later. So, you know, people, so you don't even need to have self-censorship with Bolloré. He's not a discrete owner in terms of interventions. But with other media owners, it's kind of more complicated because first of all, we don't have to be completely negative about all the owners, and it's not because you're a billionaire that you're a bad guy per se. I think the big issue with having billionaires owning the media is that you will have one guy deciding everything, and even if the guy is nice, today he can cross the road, be struck by a car and died. And his son or daughter can be much less nice, or he can change his mind. So it's always dangerous, let's say, to depend on simply one person. So this is the first problem. And the second problem is that if you work for someone, so just take I think one of the good examples that shows the limits of the system is the one of the Washington Post. If you ask journalists of the Washington Post, you know, Jeff Bezos is not in the newsroom every day. He kind of put a lot of money in the newspaper. So he bought it at a very low price, about 250 million euros. I would love to be able to buy a newspaper for that. But if you compare with the 44 billion of and to the value of the newspaper is not so expensive. At the time, the Washington Post was losing a lot of money, and he invested 250 million euros right away. So and now the newspaper is doing much better. So overall, it's better the Post with Bezos in a sense that the Post that can have disappear. So this is the positive side.
But the Washington Post had a very strong culture,
and
right?
the other thing that the Washington Post has a very strong culture of independence at the time, so it's kind of hard, you know, to show up in the newsroom and to say I'm going to censor this content. Now, one of the things that is of interest is to compare the content of the Washington Post with the one of the New York Times, for example, and to see the extent to which Bezos was the journalists are still dealing with the sector of the e-commerce. And basically, you know, it's super difficult for them because if they talk well about Amazon, they're kind of afraid that everybody will say, this is because they're owned by Bezos, so they want to please him. But if they talk badly about Amazon, you know, they might be afraid that even if Bezos is not going to censor the content, that at some point he might say, okay, this is not the reason why I buy this newspaper, I'm going to sell it. So basically, what do? they no longer cover the e-commerce because they don't know how to do that. And it's very, very hard, you know, to like cover a sector with a sector where your main owner is making his money from. And I think this is one of the big issues you have now with this media ownership that is made by people from outside of the media industry.
You said at the beginning, Julia, that we can actually compare the French market with the international market because there are parallels in both markets, but there is a limit, of course, to this argument, and you yourself have pointed out to this limit. This is a case that Bolloré is making, that he's saying we need to merge French companies to compete against these enormous GAFAM companies, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, all of them, you know, Netflix, Disney, we can think of a whole list. And you've said that this is not only an illogical argument, but it's ultimately damaging because not only if we make this argument will we lose French pluralism, but even a big merged French company is tiny compared to a GAFAM company. Can you speak to this argument?
I think for those of you who speak French, if you have like a little bit of time to lose and you want to have a little bit of fun, you should listen to Vincent Bolloré in front of the Commission d'enquête du Sénat. So the French Senate Investigatory Commission, which was investigating the issue of media concentration. So Bolloré went in front of the commission with some slides, and on the slide, you know, you had like a big bullet, like for Google, one from Amazon, one from Facebook, and you know, at the other side, like you have a very, very tiny Bolloré. And he spent his own like time in front of the commission saying that, oh, we are so small, we are super tiny, we are super tiny. Okay, the thing is, but you know, like you were my student, and the question is, if I have someone that in class come and tell me, oh, this company is bigger than this other company because look at its total revenue, they're like, okay, but you need to do some normalization. And what matters in terms of normalization is the market size. Obviously, if you take the total revenues of Google versus the total revenues even of like TF1, the total revenues of Google are going to be much larger. In one case, the market size is the entire world, and in the other case, the market size in France. So I know that people still believe since De Gaulle that we are like a large country, but still we are not the size of the entire world. And so it cannot really work this way, but this is the kind of arguments that are used. So like talking about TF1 and M6, what is going to happen is that, so TF1 #1 channel in France in terms of audience, M6 #2 private channel in France in terms of audience, and it's not only one channel. Okay, you have like 5-6 channels in TF1 group, 5-6 in M6 group. They're going to merge together. TF1 is going to buy M6, and this would be like the largest media company in France, which is a big issue in terms of concentration, in particular in terms of news, because if you look at 1 p.m. and like 8 p.m. like the big like news shows in France, if you take TF1 for example, so with TF1 M6 you will have TF1, LCI, M6, plus you can also like take into account TMC, and basically these guys they reach between 60 and 70% of the entire French audience watching the news at the time. So this is huge in terms of concentration. And the guys say, no, we need to do that because we are too small in the international competition, and we are, for example, too small with respect to Netflix. So we cannot compete against Netflix. So one of the things that I did in my book is a very, very simple calculation. I took all the French TV channels, the public TV channels, the private TV channels, the ones that are for free, the one that you need to pay. I took all of them. I sum up all their revenues. You take all their revenues of all the French TV channels existing today, you are still very far, not from the total revenues of Netflix, very far from the annual amount invested by Netflix each year in terms of like content production. So you know this argument, it cannot work. We can also merge like together the entire European media industry if you want to compete with the guys. It does not mean that we do not have an issue. We do have an issue with Google, Amazon, Facebook, Netflix, and we do need to regulate them. And I think from this point of view, the DMA, the DSA are good attempts, and they're going to allow us to make some progress. But it's not because we're having a hard time regulating what we call the GAFA that we should kill all national regulations that are here to protect media pluralism.
Right. Let's talk about GAFA, Julia, because you said in the same interview in Jacobin magazine, you said, in general, I don't really take the United States as an example of functional democracy because it really isn't.
Yeah. So is that a question or?
Well, the question is, what's the relationship between your belief that America isn't a functional democracy and its huge GAFAM corporations?
No, in this interview, the point I had about whether the US can be considered as a functional democracy, it was more with respect to like the price of democracy, okay, and to the issue of the funding of the US democracy. In a number of like Western democracies, even if far from perfect, we are doing better in terms of regulated donations to political parties, donations to candidates, and how much candidates can spend, for example, for elections, than that's what we are doing in other countries.
But do you think you can still make the same point with relation to American media?
So, like the American media in terms of concentration, and it's, so again, it depends a little bit on how you define
right.
How you define the media. You have part of the media industry in the US that is doing better than in other countries, and part that is not. For example, as of today, I'm kind of super worried, but I'm very far from being the only one, about the fact that we have a lot of like news desert, and in particular local news desert in the US, and basically you have like huge number now of counties without any local newspapers, without any local news. There is this big issue also in the US that you don't really have any public funding for the media, and you don't have in particular any public funding not only for the public media but also for the private media, and this we need to introduce it. And there is then the issue of the regulation of the platform. I would say that a couple of years ago, the US was trying to attempt something. This was part of the discussion for the 2020 primaries within the Democratic Party, in particular with Elizabeth Warren, who is a lawyer, and who had a kind of interesting proposal to introduce more competition, and in particular to force like Google and Facebook kind of like to split. And for example, Facebook would have had to sell WhatsApp and these other companies. At the end of the day, she did not win. Now, like it's part of what the Biden administration is thinking about. So we might have some regulation, but it's also far from being happening today.
Yeah, let's talk about the lack of regulation in relationship to the extent to which America is democratic or not. I'd love to have your thoughts, of course, on Elon Musk and Twitter. You spoke about it this morning on the radio. Given that Twitter has 200 million plus daily users, and it's a company that influences the public debate, journalistic debate, and of course, really urgent issues of fake news and disinformation. You said, Julia, this morning that and we can probably all agree here, that one person with this much power is obscene and inappropriate. And I think it's even more obscene and inappropriate given that Elon Musk is himself very erratic, quite churlish, and is calling openly for complete freedom of expression, which means complete deregulation of the platform. And so questions, follow: will Trump rejoin Twitter? What happens to our access to Russian content? Will the CEO, Jack Dorsey, reappear? Can you just speak to what's happening right now with Twitter and to what extent it reveals to us America's broken relationship to news and information?
What is happening today with Twitter, it really means that now there is no regulation that can impede someone with enough money to buy all the media outlets he wants to buy.
Even if it's not clear from where he's going to get the money.
In particular, and in the case of like Musk is clearly not doing that because it's a profitable industry. Like Twitter is losing money. It has always been losing money. It's kind of hard to see how it's going to make it a profitable business. And you know, he made the first offer and the guy said no. He came back with 44 billion. But you know, if you're able to buy, like, to put 44 million on the table, basically you can buy more or less anything. And there is no limit to that. And for him, we can say, oh, this is a lot of money. But at the end of the day, I think his personal wealth is estimated to like $250 billion. So it's kind of like much more. And like 44 is as if like you were making a big financial effort to buy a very, very nice car with compared to your total wealth. But here the car is called Twitter. And I think it really means that if one has enough money to try to influence the public debate, whether by like buying a media, creating a new media, buying a social media, now there is no regulation that is impeding that. And I think we shouldn't spend like so much time on Musk himself. I don't think he's a very nice guy. He's not a very nice guy. People say, oh, he is in favor of freedom of speech. If you look at the content of his own tweets, you do not really have the impression that this guy is in favor of the freedom of speech. But I don't want to say that this is bad because the guy is a libertarian or because in support of Trump. That would be about talking about my own politics in a sense. I would be as unhappy with Bill Gates buying Twitter. First of all, because I think it's dangerous to have like so much power between the hands of a single person. And the second thing is that I really don't think we should say that, oh, the guy is nice, so everything is going to happen well. Because a guy can be nice day A and not be nice at all day B. And then whether or not he's nice, you know, it really depends on like a lot of different things. At the time, like in the 19th century in the US, some government, I'm thinking about like Teddy Roosevelt at the time of John Rockefeller, they were able to put barrier and to put limit and to put an end to overconcentration. And the thing is that I don't know who is Teddy Roosevelt today. And I am afraid that there is no willingness to fight against these very big players. And to be totally honest, the big issue with what is happening with Musk is that it would have been much better for the Biden administration to regulate before. They were like thinking about it, like thinking about like regulating social media. And in particular, you know, there was all this debate about what is called like Section 230. So the fact that the platforms are not responsible for the content that is on the platforms because they do not have the same legal status as the newspapers, for example, they are not considered as like direct like media. So there was this debate about like whether they should be responsible for the content they post. And you know, there was this attempt of like, okay, whether we should have less concentration and whether they should be responsible for speech. They did not do it like during the past 2 years. But now if they were to do that, this will be seen as something against the Republicans. So this is going to polarize much more this debate. Well, this debate should not be polarized because it should not be an issue of like a Republican versus Democrat or left versus right. But with the buyout by Musk of Twitter, this is going to make it much more difficult, in fact, for the Biden administration to do anything to regulate the social media.
Let's turn, before we all despair too much, let's turn to the solutions that you yourself proposed, Julia. So one solution, it's important to point out that you and your co-author have argued that the over-concentration of any media sector is not inevitable. It might feel inevitable, we're kind of locked into the system, but it's not inevitable. This is your point. The first solution you argue is for an information democratization law. Can you tell us some specific and practical conditions of this law that you outline?
I think I'm going to give you the spirit of the law. In the sense, the spirit of the law that we outline is to say that we need to think separately about who owns the capital and who has the voting share. And so that we need to disentangle between, from the one hand, the capital shares, and from the other hand, the vote within the boards. I think this is super important because when I was, you know, I've been working a lot of times on the media industry, and I really think that it would be better to have like a more democratic ownership of the media. With much more shareholders, and that it would be better to have like among the shareholders, the journalists, the employees to begin with, but also the readers. Then you see the big issue is that if you look at something like TF1 buyout of M6, I don't remember exactly, but we are talking about like 2 to 3 billion euros. I'm good at doing crowdfunding. I worked with some company, you know, doing some crowdfunding campaign. I'm not good at raising 2 to 3 billion euros. But the issue is to say that even if you don't do that, because if you cannot do that, and you have like some owners owning the majority of the capital shares, there is some way to reduce their power and to make the working of the media outlets more democratic. And the idea is really to say, okay, like a number of media outlets, they benefit from numerous advantages. For example, in France, if you are on newspapers, you benefit from a lot of public subsidies. You are not going to pay full rate VAT, for example. You are going to pay a VAT that's equal to 2.1%. You are going to have also a lot of like postal subsidies. If you have a TV channel in France, you know, you have your authorization to broadcast for free. So I think this should come with some like condition, and among the condition is to say that half of the board members should be made of the employees and journalists. So this is condition 1 of the democratization law. And I just want to highlight something. You know, when you say this kind of stuff, a lot of people are going to say, "Oh, you cannot do that. You know, you cannot like separate the capital share from the voting right. This is going to be like against capitalism." You know, the number 1 firm who did it was Google. When Google was made public in the US, they did 2 kinds of shares, shares of type A and shares of type B. The shares of type A was with 10 votes for each share, and the share of type B was with 1 vote for each share. And the 2 founders of Google, they did it. Why? Because with their shares of type A, at the end of the day, even if they were like minority shareholders in terms of capital shares, they still have the majority of the voting rights. They were able to keep control on that. Another funny example, you know, a lot of people at some point, they were asking why Alibaba, the Chinese company, when it went public, it did not went public in China, but in the US. They did it because in the US, they could do these 2 kinds of shares. Share of type A, share of type B, so that you can keep control even if you don't have all the capital. So this is a tool, first of all, that is in the law, but that is used by a lot of companies, a lot of tech companies, and they do that to keep power. So I think we could do the same, but to make sure that the power is equitably shared between many different people.
One of the subpoints of the law that particularly interests me is the transparency of the ownership. And I'm curious, and so you in your own words, the transparency of the immediate ownership involving disclosure of the name of the beneficial owner and of its activities, how would that actually look in kind of concrete terms, in terms of, apart from us knowing who owns it, how would that kind of come out in our consumption of the media?
The thing is that you want to know where the conflict of interest may be.
So would it say at the top of an article about Amazon?
No, so it won't be at the top of the article, but the idea is that it will be visible. It could be visible on all the print version of the Washington Post, so it won't be like at the top, you know, but you just need to know how to find the information. So for example, in France, if you take a newspaper, you have a number of things that are in the law, and you have the thing that is called the ours. So I don't know whether you open Le Monde or Libération, any newspapers in France, you have the name of the director of the publication and the name, all this information that you have to put them by law. And you can also say that the owners of this publication are, but I don't care that the guy who owns the publication is Jeff Bezos. I do care that he makes the majority of his money from e-commerce. So that when you read the Washington Post and you read an article about Amazon, you get this information that you can have some bias.
Can you talk, Julia, about media vouchers as your other solution?
So media vouchers is I think the first time I really thought about it was in the US. So we were asked, we're a group of like lawyers and economists by the Stigler Center. They make a big report about the future of the media, and the idea was to say what should we do about it. And we were like 6 or 7 persons and thinking about, okay, perhaps we should introduce some like public funding for the media. And you know, I don't know why they asked me. I guess because I was French, so like government intervention, you know, is really labeled as a French thing. But to be serious, it's like the first thing is that it's kind of surprising that in the US everybody is against public funding, because if you think a little bit about history, the US was the very first country in the world to introduce public funding for the media. It was in 1796 with postal subsidies for the news, but then they forget their own history. But the second thing is that so people are afraid that if you introduce public funding for the media, you will have some government intervention. And this is not completely stupid. You can do it in a transparent way. Like, for example, if you do reduce VAT, you do not have any room for government intervention. Same VAT, right? But it has like other problem with reduced VAT, because if it is reduced VAT, basically it's going to favor more those media that are already doing very well. Those that are struggling, they are going to benefit less from that. But I was thinking like about a way to have like public subsidies for the news without government intervention. And this was for the Stigler Center. The Stigler Center is part of the Chicago University. So Chicago style economics. When you talk about like French public funding, they are not big fan ex ante. And we had this very good idea, was to say, okay, so let's have public funding, public money for the news, but let's decentralize entirely the allocation. So this was just the idea. So no government intervention. It would be like purely market driven in a sense. So what are the media vouchers? You take the amount of public funding you want to allocate to the media. You split it equally between all the different citizens. You give each citizen a media voucher of equivalent value. So in the proposal we computed for the US, it was like $50. And you allow the citizens to allocate the public funding to the media outlets of their choice.
And it's inspired a little bit by something that happens in Italy with tax donations. Can you explain the inspiration?
Yeah, so this was inspired at the beginning by a proposal I made in the Price of Democracy for the funding of political parties, and something that I called the democratic equality vouchers. And I was thinking about the democratic equality vouchers. In fact, I realized it was feasible thanks to something happening in Italy that is called the due per mille. So in fact, the due per mille in Italy is the following. It's the fact that in Italy, when you make your when you fill your tax form, you can indicate the political parties to which you want 2% of your tax amount to be allocated. So this is kind of new in Italy because it was introduced in 2014, but this is not so new in the way it works, because this is the way churches are funded in Italy since the 1970s. So we have something in Italy that is called the auto per mille. And in Italy, since the 1970s, when Italian citizens, they fill their tax form, they indicate the church to which they want 8% of their total income tax to be allocated. In a sense, because we are talking about the US, there is something else in the US that kind of resembles the media vouchers, which are the democratic vouchers that were introduced by the city of Seattle in 2017. So now if you live in the city of Seattle and you are a registered voter, you are going to receive before the local elections 4 vouchers worth $25 that you can allocate to the candidate of your choice. So not exactly to the candidate of your choice, because the candidate, to be allowed to receive the vouchers, they have to commit not to receive any private donations. So basically the city of Seattle, they introduced this system because basically they wanted to limit private donations. They cannot do that because of the Supreme Court. And the fact that the Supreme Court in the US strangely consider that money is speech. So basically for them, if you limit donations to political parties, you are limiting speech. And so this is against the First Amendment. So they could not, in fact, impede candidates to receive private donations or cap these private donations. So they kind of played around and they say, okay, now we introduce this public funding scheme, but to make it work, we are going to say, candidates, you have to choose. Either you kind of opt in the democratic vouchers and you're going to receive a lot of public funding, or you rely on the private money.
Julia, I have one more question for you before we turn to your questions, possibly in the audience, definitely on Zoom. I'm struck and have been moved by the intensity and passion with which you talk about these ideas that you're researching in your academia. I'm struck too by essentially the language of war that you used, or a kind of a battle, I'll explain, to describe the publication of your recent book. So information is a public good, which I don't have here, but I've read. And so in the description around the book, you write, information is a public good aims to arm citizens, journalists, and regulators by shedding light on the different forms of media ownership and the limits of existing regulations. These are not technical issues, but the fundamentals of an informed democratic debate. And then you, in a kind of call to arms, say, join us in this fight.
Okay.
Maybe this was the press around it, but I suppose it is true that you often intervene in the kind of in the world of ideas outside of academia. You were on France Inter this morning.
Yeah, and I set up an association in defense of media independence.
So
that's true.
Right. So how do you conceive of your work in academia, in the world outside of academia? That would be my final question.
They are separate and they are related in a sense. So, for example, I have worked for years on the issue of the funding of democracy, and I have written like a number of like well-published, boring articles where I study the causal relationship, for example, between campaign expenditures and votes. This is a lot of work, intense work that I can do alone or with some co-authors, but not with a lot of fun. When you work with like a data set that you can spend kind of like months collected in the archive, or like working with the tax data with like millions of rows, and you need to clean everything and to make sure everything works, and it's kind of, and I think it's pretty important. Then I kind of wrote The Price of Democracy, because I think that there are lessons that we can learn from the results of the academic research. And that that these results are not going to be available to either politicians or citizens by thanks to God. You need to do something about it, and in particular, you need to make it accessible, let's say, to the general audience. And for me, it's kind of it's part of my job. So my research is not political. If you read my articles, they're like positive in a sense, like in opposition to like normative. Even if the topics, obviously, I'm not working on them. Like in econ, you can just work on do industrial organization and work on the cereal industry and try to understand the price of cereals. Okay, I decided to work on the price of democracy. So obviously the way you pick the topic, it's a little bit driven by your own political interest, and it's not by luck, that I decided to work on the media industry. But I try to do my research as seriously as possible, and this is really the first thing that I try also to teach my PhD students. You should go like through, all the conferences, give all the seminars in all the universities, and write the articles. You need to do it. It's kind of like super defined, and like do theoretical model and do the math and do the fancy econometric specification. You should do that super seriously, but then you can also make it like useful for the rest of the world. So just like one example on CNews and Bolloré, I was referring to that before, like with 3 co-authors, we have spent kind of years studying the evolution of the content of the French media between 2002 and 2020. When I say years, it's years of work, because we have studied like hundreds of thousands of TV programs, like millions of guests. Then we have classified like 3 million of people politically, like first of all deciding whether or not they were involved into politics, then finding their political parties. We can change over time. Then we have like studying the evolution of their speaking time. Everything we have documented. We have spent like days, hours, weeks cleaning names of guys by hand, like deciding whether this Jean-Martin was also this Jean-Martin or a different Jean-Martin that cannot be like put in the same party. So we did all that, and we will have a very nice academic publication. But then, part of this is also to demonstrate the fact that media ownership matters, and Vincent Bolloré did have an impact. And de facto, for example, we have worked on that for years, but I had in mind at the end of the day, like for the last month, a big deadline. The big deadline was February 2022 of this year, because I knew this was the day where officially Vincent Bolloré retired, and everybody would talk about it. And this was like before the end of the presidential election, and Zemmour like doing very well in the poll. And when we finish the article that we will publish like in academic format in English with all the code and all the peer reviewing everything, we also did like a full page in Le Monde and a lot of interviews where I was no longer like using the boring academic language, but saying that, oh guys, we should do something against Bolloré, So you can do a little bit of both, and this is why at the end of the day I decided to do a PhD in economics rather than on James Joyce, for example. No, but to be totally honest, that's true. Like when I was your age, I knew I wanted to do research, but in terms of topic, it was much more complicated. And in particular, I was thinking about doing some like humanities, because I loved reading. I was reading novels all the time, and I was thinking a lot at the time about, I was a little bit dreaming about Jean-Paul Sartre. Seriously, it was true. Like, this is. But then I realized that I would have more impact, in a sense, by doing some economics than by doing philosophy. Perhaps because I was better on that, or because perhaps economists now have a more impact in the public debate.
Julia, thank you so much. Can we have a big round of applause, please? I'm looking at the time, and we promised you a half past leave. So are there any questions in the room? First of all, yes. Will you speak as quickly as possible?
Thank you very much for tonight. Can you say what role artificial intelligence plays in this concentration? And secondly, unrelated, what do you think de Tocqueville would say about all this?
So I have 30 seconds to answer. I'm not a big fan of Tocqueville, to be totally honest, for a number of different reasons. But to begin with, because when I read Tocqueville with today's eyes, I think we realize, so he was super useful when he wrote what he wrote at the time, because you can read it at the way to have some comparative history, like between France and the US, and see the development of the democracy, of the press, etc. When you read it from like today's eyes, I think you really realize how conservative Tocqueville was. But so I don't know what he would say about it. About artificial intelligence, I think it plays a very big role, in particular in algorithms, in fact, in the way we consume news. In particular, what is completely striking is the fact that you have much more media concentration online than offline. This can seem strange, because people are going to say, no, offline you have a limited amount of media outlets, and online you have like an infinite amount of media outlets. Yes, but the fact is that we don't really care. Concentration is not only about having 2 outlets or 10 outlets, it's about the market shares of all the outlets. So what we call in English, in economics, the Herfindahl index. And so in fact, you have much more concentration if you have like 5 outlets, one with 99% of the market share and 4 with the remaining 1%, than if you have 2 outlets, each of them with 50% of the market share. Or it turned out that with all the way, now we no longer like go directly to the website of the media outlet, but we use what we call aggregators. Either we use like Google News, Yahoo News, or we go on the website of the media outlets through the social media, for example, Facebook. And this either platforms or social media, in fact, they are using artificial intelligence to offer us the content they think we are willing to see. And the thing is that the content they think we are willing to see depend a lot on the preferences expressed by others. And at the end of the day, it means that we all tend like to go not on Le Monde, Libération, Le Figaro, La Tribune, whatever. We all go on Google News, and we will all see the articles that are on top of Google News at a given moment of time. So in fact, in our behaviors, despite the fact that artificially you have like more websites than, let's say, print newspapers, in our behaviors, in fact, at the end of the day, there is more concentration online because of the way this, you have all the literature talking about a filter bubble, etc. Because of the way these algorithms work, they all recommend us basically to read the same kind of stuff.
Okay, one more question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask basically what you defined as the press, the media, because you also have, right, the Associated Press, l'Association France Presse, and most of the journalistic work nowadays in a lot of newspaper is actually just taking les dépêches. So why are you only maybe targeting like the public journal like Le Monde and this? And second, which is a related question, and there's also academic journal, professional journal, and those type of thing. And the second thing is like, can it really work that in one sector, like you will impose a more democratic or, maybe corporative way of like agencing the thing, but then like the journalist schools are going to run like on a normal, like, capitalist model, like l'Agence France-Presse va être capitalist on a capitalist model, like Elsevier and academic. So yeah, kind of.
I'm going to answer on the news agency. It turned out that April 27. So in 3 days, it will no longer be the case. But until April 30, I'm a board member of the Agence France-Presse. Why am I a board member of the Agence France-Presse? Because the way Agence France-Presse work is that there is a board where part of the board is made of the clients of the agency, so the newspapers, TV channel, radio stations, and also some representatives from the government. And part of the board is made of what they call qualified personality, so people who work on the media that are sitting on the board to make sure that the agency is producing the news in an independent way. So this is not a capitalistic model. And this is the same thing for the AP. Different board model, but AP, in fact, it's a cooperative. It's not a capitalistic model. It's a non-for-profit model. Reuters is different because the history of Reuters is different. But the main two agencies, you have 3 main news agencies in the world, Reuters, AP, and Agence France-Presse. Out of the 3, two of them are non-capitalistic and not for profit. And this is key because this agency, you are right, are at the center of the news ecosystem, and you want to be sure that the news they kind of produce is factual news. So in terms of democratic governance, that's for sure we need that for the news agency. It's more or less like okay, and there is a big difference between AFP, for example, and like other news agencies like in Germany or in Spain or whatever, that are like kind of national news agency with government control. Like the AFP, because it has kind of a longer history, we're able to have this like a different kind of board who allow also it to have like an international reach because it can protect the independence of the news that is produced. It does not mean that we cannot do better. I guess we can always do better, but it means that this cannot be considered as a capitalistic companies in a proper sense.
Thank you. So can we have a big final round of applause, please, for Julia? Thank you. In the interest of time, I'll just say this, that the American Library in Paris is truly a democratically non-profit organization. We are not owned by one large billionaire. We are funded by your donations. We host all of these events for free. We do it 2 times a week in person and on Zoom. And so we suggest €10 per person per event. And thank you very much in advance for your donation.